In 1812, the brothers Grimm were meticulously collecting folk tales across the German territories, seeking authentic stories that had been passed down through generations. What they discovered in a remote village near the Harz Mountains would challenge everything they thought they knew about the beloved tale of Sleeping Beauty. The story they uncovered was so disturbing that it was deliberately omitted from their published collections, buried in personal correspondence that wouldn't surface for over a century. The village of Steinbach sat nestled between dense pine forests and limestone cliffs, approximately 15 kilometers south of Goslar. Its population barely exceeded 200 souls, most of whom lived in timber-framed houses that had stood for generations. The settlement was known for its isolation and the peculiar loyalty of its residents to traditions that seemed to predate Christianity itself. Local records from the parish of St. Nicholas show gaps in documentation spanning several decades, with entire family lines appearing and disappearing from official registers without explanation. It was during the harsh winter of 1811 that Wilhelm Grimm first heard whispers of the Dornwald family. Unlike other tales he and his brother Jacob collected, this story came with warnings. The village innkeeper, a man named Heinrich Müller, refused to speak of the family directly, referring only to the sleepers in the old manor and crossing himself whenever their name was mentioned. Müller's reluctance was shared by most villagers, who would fall silent whenever strangers inquired about the abandoned estate on the hill. The Dornwald Manor stood 3 kilometers north of the village centre, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through increasingly dense woodland. The house itself was a testament to medieval architecture, built in the late 14th century with thick stone walls and narrow windows that seemed designed more for defense than illumination. Local tax records from 1760 show the property was inhabited by Edmund Dornwald, his wife Margaret, and their daughter Rosalind, though neighbors reported seeing the family only during harvest festivals and Easter services. According to parish burial records, Edmund Dornwald died in 1778, followed by his wife 2 years later. Their deaths should have left 18-year-old Rosalind as the sole heir, but villagers insisted she had vanished years before her parents' passing. The official explanation was that she had married and moved to distant relatives in Bavaria, though no documentation of such a union existed in church records. More troubling was the fact that several villagers reported seeing lights in the manor windows long after the family's supposed extinction. The first documented account of something amiss at the Dornwald estate comes from a letter written by Pastor Johann Kleist in 1781. Kleist, who served the parish of St. Nicholas for 43 years, wrote to his bishop describing unnatural disturbances at the manor. He mentioned sounds of singing that could be heard on windless nights, always the same melody, always a woman's voice. Several parishioners had approached him about the phenomenon, asking if they should investigate, but Kleist advised against any contact with the property. The pastor's letters, discovered in the episcopal archives of Hildesheim in 1952, reveal a pattern of increasingly strange reports. In 1783, he wrote of finding fresh flowers at the manor's gate every Sunday morning, arranged in patterns that suggested religious significance but followed no Christian symbolism he recognized. Local children reported seeing a woman in white walking the manor's gardens, though she was never close enough to identify clearly. When pressed for details, the children would describe her as sleeping while walking and refuse to elaborate further. Village records from the late 18th century show an unusual number of disappearances among young women. Between 1780 and 1790, 7 unmarried women between the ages of 18 and 25 vanished without explanation. Their families reported that each had spoken of strange dreams in the weeks before their disappearance, dreams of a beautiful woman who called to them from the forest. The missing women came from different families and social classes. but all shared certain characteristics. They were described as exceptionally beautiful, unmarried, and known for their intelligence and independence. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for the intervention of Father Benedict Hoffmann, who arrived in Steinbach in 1791 to replace the aging Pastor Kleist. Hoffmann, a younger man educated in seminary theology and natural philosophy, approached the mystery with scholarly determination rather than superstitious fear. His detailed journals, preserved in the monastery of St. Michael in Hildesheim, provide the most complete account of what he discovered at the Dornwald Manor. Hoffmann's investigation began with a careful review of church records dating back to 1500. He discovered that the Dornwald family had a history of unusual deaths and disappearances stretching back generations. Women in the family frequently died young, often in their sleep, while men typically lived to advanced ages but remained unmarried after their wives' deaths. More disturbing was the pattern of missing persons reports that coincided with periods when the family was actively residing at the manor. In the spring of 1792, Hoffmann convinced 3 trusted parishioners to accompany him on an official investigation of the property. The group included Thomas Weber, a local blacksmith known for his practical nature, Anna Richter, a midwife who had delivered most of the village children, and Friedrich Stein, a former soldier who had served in the Austrian campaigns. Their testimony, recorded in Hoffmann's journal, describes what they found in the manor's cellars. The house appeared abandoned from the outside, with overgrown gardens and shuttered windows. However, the front door was unlocked, and the interior showed signs of recent habitation. Fresh flowers adorned tables in the main hall, and the air carried the scent of recently extinguished candles. Most unsettling was the sound of breathing that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, rhythmic and deep, as if the house were a living creature at rest. Weber later described feeling an overwhelming urge to sleep as soon as they entered the building. Richter reported that her legs became increasingly heavy with each step, while Stein noted that his usual alertness gave way to a dreamlike state that made it difficult to focus on their surroundings. Only Hoffmann seemed unaffected, though he would later write of feeling as though he were walking through water rather than air. The cellar entrance was hidden behind what appeared to be a wine cabinet in the manor's kitchen. The cabinet moved easily despite its apparent weight, revealing stone steps that descended into complete darkness. The group's lanterns cast dancing shadows on walls that bore carved symbols none of them recognized. The symbols appeared to be much older than the house itself, suggesting that the manor had been built over a site of previous significance. At the bottom of the steps, they discovered a chamber that defied the architectural logic of the house above. The space was circular and much larger than the cellar should have accommodated, with a domed ceiling that rose at least 20 feet. Around the chamber's perimeter stood 12 stone slabs, each carved to resemble a bed. 11 of the slabs were empty, their surfaces worn smooth by age and use. The 12th held the figure of a young woman. The woman appeared to be sleeping peacefully, her hands folded across her chest in the manner of medieval tomb effigies. However, she was not carved from stone, but appeared to be a living person in a state of unnaturally deep sleep. Her skin was pale but warm to the touch, her breathing barely perceptible but regular. She wore a white gown that showed no signs of age or decay, despite the chamber's obvious antiquity. Hoffmann's examination of the sleeping woman revealed several disturbing details. Her hair, while clean and well-maintained, had grown to an unusual length, suggesting she had been in this state for years or even decades. Her fingernails were similarly overgrown but had been recently trimmed. Most troubling was her apparent age. She looked no older than 20, despite the evidence suggesting she had been in the chamber for much longer than any normal human lifespan would allow. Around the woman's neck hung a pendant that Hoffman recognized from his studies of pre-Christian Germanic symbols. The pendant bore the image of a spindle surrounded by thorny vines, with inscriptions in what appeared to be runic script. When he attempted to examine the pendant more closely, the woman stirred slightly, causing the entire group to retreat in terror. Hoffman noted that her movement was accompanied by a sound like wind through dead leaves, though the chamber was sealed and airless. The discovery of personal items around the chamber provided clues to the woman's identity and the fate of the missing villagers. Hoffman catalogued jewelry, clothing fragments and personal effects that matched descriptions of items belonging to young women who had vanished over the previous decades. Most items showed signs of age and decay, but some appeared fresh, suggesting that disappearances had continued more recently than village records indicated. Weber's examination of the chamber's construction revealed evidence of much older foundations beneath the current structure. The stone used in the circular chamber was different from that used in the manor above, suggesting it predated the house by centuries or perhaps millennia. Carved channels in the floor led from each stone slab toward a central drain, though the purpose of these channels was unclear. Richter's medical knowledge allowed her to observe details that the men might have missed. She noted that the sleeping woman's body showed no signs of the muscle atrophy that would normally result from prolonged immobility. Her skin was free of bed sores or other indicators of extended bed rest. Most puzzling was the woman's apparent nutrition. Her body appeared healthy and well-nourished, despite showing no evidence of recent food consumption. The group's investigation was cut short by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. As they examined the chamber, they heard footsteps on the stairs above. The sound was distinctive, the measured pace of someone descending carefully, as if carrying a burden. Hoffman motioned for silence, and the group positioned themselves to observe whoever was entering their hiding place. The figure that appeared was an elderly man, bent with age but moving with surprising steadiness. He carried a silver tray containing what appeared to be fresh flowers and a crystal vial filled with dark liquid. His clothes were well maintained, but of a style that had been out of fashion for decades. Most unsettling was his behavior. He moved through the chamber as if he were alone, arranging flowers around the sleeping woman and dropping liquid from the vial onto her lips. The man's care in tending to the sleeping woman suggested a routine developed over many years. He cleaned her fingernails with small scissors, combed her hair with gentle strokes, and adjusted her gown with the practiced efficiency of a long-time caretaker. Throughout this process, he hummed a melody that Hoffman recognized as the same tune villagers had reported hearing from the manor on quiet nights. When the man finished his ministrations, he approached each of the empty stone slabs in turn, placing a single flower on each surface. His movements were ritualistic, suggesting these actions held deep significance beyond mere decoration. As he worked, he spoke in a dialect so archaic that even Hoffman, with his educational background, could understand only fragments of what was being said. The words that could be understood were disturbing in their implications. The man spoke of preparing the garden and gathering the roses, while referring to the sleeping woman as the mother of dreams. He mentioned names that matched several of the missing village women, speaking of them as if they were present in the chamber, despite the obvious emptiness of their stone beds. The group's hiding place was eventually discovered when Weber inadvertently knocked over their lantern in his attempt to get a better view of the proceedings. The crash of breaking glass echoed through the chamber, causing the elderly man to freeze in his activities. When he turned toward their position, his face revealed features that challenged their understanding of human aging. The man appeared to be at least 70 years old, with deeply lined skin and hair white as winter snow. However, his eyes held a clarity and intelligence that suggested a much younger mind trapped in an aged body. More disturbing was his lack of surprise at discovering intruders in what he clearly considered his private domain. He simply nodded to them as if their presence had been expected and returned to his work. When Hoffman attempted to speak to the man, asking about his identity and the nature of his activities, the response was delivered in the same archaic dialect. Gradually, however, the man's speech modernized, as if he were remembering how to communicate with people from the current century. He identified himself as Edmund Dornwald, the same Edmund whose death had been recorded in parish records 14 years earlier. Dornwald's explanation of his survival and activities challenged everything the group thought they understood about death and time. He claimed to be under a compact that required him to maintain the chamber and care for its occupant until certain conditions were fulfilled. The compact, he explained, bound him to the estate, regardless of his physical death, forcing him to continue his duties in a state between life and death. The sleeping woman, according to Dornwald, was his daughter Rosalind, though he admitted she was also something more than his child. He described her as the culmination of a family tradition stretching back to pre-Roman times, when Germanic tribes practiced forms of worship that required living sacrifices to ensure fertility and protection. The Dornwald family had been guardians of these traditions, adapting them over centuries to survive Christian conversion and social change. Dornwald's account of how Rosalind came to her current state involved rituals that combined ancient Germanic practices with elements borrowed from medieval alchemy and early folk medicine. On her 18th birthday, she had voluntarily undergone a ceremony that would preserve her youth indefinitely, while granting her the power to influence the dreams and fates of other young women in the region. The process required Rosalind to consume a preparation made from plants that grew only in the deepest parts of the surrounding forest, combined with substances that Dornwald refused to identify completely. The mixture induced a death-like sleep that could last for decades or centuries, during which her spirit would travel through the dreams of susceptible individuals, drawing them to the manor for purposes he described only as completion of the circle. According to Dornwald, the other young women who had disappeared had come to the manor of their own accord, drawn by dreams they could not resist. Once there, they underwent a similar ceremony, but without Rosalind's natural resistance to the process. Their deaths, while peaceful, were necessary to maintain Rosalind's extended sleep and to preserve the family's ancient obligations to forces he could not name directly. The group's confrontation with these revelations was interrupted by sounds from above that suggested other visitors had arrived at the manor. Footsteps moved across the floors above them, accompanied by voices speaking in hushed tones. Dornwald showed no concern about these new arrivals, suggesting that their presence was either expected or irrelevant to his immediate concerns. Weber's practical mind focused on the possibility of escape, noting that their current position in the chamber offered no alternative exits. The single stairway they had used to descend was their only route back to the surface, and the sounds above indicated that path was no longer clear. More troubling was the realization that their lantern had been their only source of light, and its destruction left them dependent on the faint illumination provided by candles Dornwald had apparently placed throughout the chamber. The voices above grew closer, suggesting that whoever had entered the manor was descending toward their location. Hoffman attempted to convince Dornwald to help them find an alternative exit, but the old man seemed more concerned with completing his ritual activities than with the welfare of his unexpected visitors. He continued arranging flowers and tending to Rosalind despite the obvious approach of others. As footsteps began echoing on the stone stairs, the group pressed themselves into the darkest corners of the chamber, hoping to avoid detection. However, their hopes were dashed when the new arrivals proved to be village men armed with torches and farming implements. Led by Heinrich Müller, the innkeeper who had originally warned against investigating the manor, the group appeared to be conducting their own search of the property. Müller's reaction to finding the hidden chamber and its occupants was not surprise but resignation. He addressed Dornwald by name, suggesting a familiarity that contradicted his earlier claims of ignorance about the family's fate. The conversation between Müller and Dornwald revealed that several village men had known about Rosalind's condition and had been helping to maintain the deception surrounding her disappearance. The village conspiracy extended far beyond simple knowledge of the situation. Müller and his companions had been actively participating in the rituals that maintained Rosalind's supernatural sleep, providing materials and information about suitable candidates for the ceremonies. Their motivation, according to their own admissions, was protection of the village from forces they believed would be unleashed if the ancient compact was broken. Hoffmann's attempts to understand the theological implications of what he was witnessing were complicated by the villagers' mixture of Christian and pre-Christian beliefs. They spoke of Rosalind as both a saint who protected the community and a pagan entity that required regular offerings to remain quiescent. This theological confusion suggested that the situation had evolved over generations, adapting to changing religious climates while maintaining its essential character. The confrontation in the chamber reached a critical point when Richter approached the sleeping woman, despite warnings from both Dornwald and the villagers. Her medical training compelled her to examine Rosalind more closely, seeking rational explanations for the woman's preserved state. However, when she touched Rosalind's hand, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Rosalind's eyes opened for the first time since the group had discovered her, revealing pupils that reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. Her mouth moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound emerged except a whisper that seemed to come from the chamber walls themselves. The whisper spoke Richter's name, followed by words in the archaic dialect that Dornwald had been using earlier. The effect on Richter was immediate and profound. Her posture changed, becoming more rigid and formal, while her expression grew distant and dreamy. She began walking toward one of the empty stone slabs, as if compelled by an invisible force. Weber's attempts to restrain her proved futile. Despite his superior strength, he could not alter her determined progress toward what appeared to be her intended resting place. The villagers' reaction to Richter's transformation was not alarm, but acceptance tinged with sadness. Müller spoke of her as if she were already dead, mentioning that her sacrifice would ensure the village's protection for another generation. This casual acceptance of her fate suggested that similar scenes had played out regularly over the years, with the villagers serving as willing accomplices to the preservation of an ancient evil. Hoffmann's theological training provided him with resources for resistance that the others lacked. Drawing on prayers and protective rituals from his Christian education, he attempted to break whatever influence was affecting Richter. His efforts seemed to have some effect, causing Rosalind to close her eyes and return to her death-like sleep, but Richter's condition remained unchanged. The standoff in the chamber continued through the night, with the villagers preventing any escape while Hoffmann and his remaining companions tried to find a way to help Richter. Weber's practical approach involved searching the chamber for anything that might serve as a weapon or tool, but the space contained nothing except the stone slabs, flowers, and ceremonial objects associated with the family's rituals. As dawn approached, marked only by a subtle change in the air quality within the sealed chamber, Dornwald announced that the ceremony would be completed whether the observers cooperated or not. His transformation during the night had been gradual but unmistakable. The frail old man had been replaced by something with the strength and determination of someone much younger, though his physical appearance remained unchanged. The final phase of the ritual involved Richter lying on one of the stone slabs, while Dornwald prepared a mixture similar to what he had given Rosalind decades earlier. The preparation involved herbs, minerals, and substances that he retrieved from hidden compartments around the chamber. Most disturbing was the collection of hair and nail clippings that he had apparently gathered from previous victims, adding them to the mixture as if they were essential ingredients. Hoffman's final attempt to intervene involved invoking Christian authority and demanding that the villagers recognize the evil nature of what they were perpetuating. His appeals fell on deaf ears. The villagers had clearly made their peace with the situation long ago, viewing their cooperation as a necessary evil that protected the broader community from worse fates. The ceremony proceeded with Richter consuming the prepared mixture willingly, her earlier resistance having been replaced by eager cooperation. As the substance took effect, her breathing slowed and her expression became peaceful, mirroring the state they had observed in Rosalind. Within minutes, she appeared to be in the same death-like sleep, though her pulse remained detectable to those who checked. Dornwald's completion of the ritual had immediate effects on the chamber environment. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air took on a heaviness that made breathing difficult. More disturbing was the sound of movement from Rosalind's stone slab, suggesting that adding another victim had somehow strengthened her condition or awareness. The villagers' departure from the chamber was conducted with ceremonial formality, with each man placing flowers on Richter's slab before ascending the stairs. Müller was the last to leave, pausing to warn Hoffmann and Weber that their knowledge of the situation made them dangerous to village security. His words carried an implicit threat that their own survival depended on maintaining silence about what they had witnessed. Left alone with Dornwald and the two sleeping women, Hoffmann and Weber faced a choice between attempting escape and trying to find a way to reverse what had been done. Dornwald's attitude had become almost paternal, offering them food and suggesting that their presence was welcome as long as they respected the chamber's sacred nature. His casual mention of previous visitors who had chosen to remain suggested that their situation was not entirely unique. The discovery that other outsiders had encountered the situation over the years was confirmed by evidence around the chamber that Hoffmann had not noticed earlier. Personal items, partially concealed in alcoves around the circular wall, indicated that travelers, scholars, and officials had found their way to the manor over the decades. None had apparently left to report their discoveries to outside authorities. Weber's examination of these artifacts revealed that some belonged to individuals whose disappearances had been noted in official records. A medallion bore the coat of arms of a Bavarian nobleman who had vanished while traveling through the region in 1768. Documents in a leather portfolio identified their owner as a legal scholar from Göttingen who had been investigating unusual property inheritance cases in 1775. The implications of these discoveries suggested that the Dornwald family's activities had attracted attention from educated and influential people over the years, but that none had survived to expose the truth. Whether their deaths were violent or resulted from the same ceremonial process that had claimed Richter was unclear, but their personal effects implied that they had remained in the chamber long enough to remove and abandon their possessions. Hoffmann's theological perspective led him to view the situation as a test of faith that required active resistance rather than passive acceptance. He began conducting Christian prayers and rituals around the chamber, attempting to consecrate the space and break whatever non-Christian influences were maintaining the supernatural sleep. His efforts seemed to cause some disturbance to Rosalind's condition, as her peaceful expression became troubled and her breathing grew irregular. Weber's more practical approach involved searching for mechanical explanations for what they had observed. His examination of the chamber's construction revealed hidden passages behind apparently solid stone walls, suggesting that the space was more complex than it initially appeared. Some passages seemed to lead deeper underground, while others appeared to connect with the manor's upper floors through routes that had been concealed during the building's construction. The hidden passages provided evidence that the chamber had been designed for purposes beyond simple ceremonial use. Ventilation systems, though ancient, ensured that air quality remained adequate for extended occupation. Water sources, accessed through carved channels in the floor, indicated that the space could support life for extended periods. Most puzzling was a series of mirrors positioned to reflect light through the passage system, creating a form of communication network that could convey signals throughout the manor and possibly beyond. Exploration of the passage system revealed additional chambers, each containing evidence of the family's multi-generational activities. Storage rooms held preserved foods, documents, and materials for the rituals that maintained Rosalind's condition. Living quarters, furnished in styles spanning several centuries, suggested that family members had spent extended periods underground, emerging only when necessary to maintain contact with the outside world. The most disturbing discovery was a chamber containing detailed records of the family's activities, dating back to the early 16th century. Written in multiple hands and languages, the documents described ceremonies, victims, and the gradual refinement of techniques for maintaining supernatural sleep states. The records indicated that Rosalind was not the first family member to undergo the process, but rather the culmination of centuries of experimentation and improvement. Earlier attempts at achieving extended sleep had been less successful, often resulting in actual death rather than the preserved state they sought. The documents described modifications to the preparation methods, changes in ceremonial timing, and the importance of selecting appropriate secondary victims to maintain the primary subject's condition. The learning process had clearly involved considerable trial and error, with many failures recorded alongside the occasional success. The family's motivation for developing these techniques was revealed in letters and personal journals that described their role as guardians of ancient knowledge and protectors of regional stability. They believed that their activities prevented much worse supernatural influences from affecting the area, viewing their preservation of pre-Christian practices as essential to maintaining cosmic balance. According to their own accounts, the family had inherited responsibility for maintaining barriers against otherworldly forces that had been established in the region during prehistoric times. Germanic tribes had originally created these barriers through human sacrifice and ritual magic, but the spread of Christianity had made such practices impossible to continue openly. The Dornwald family had adapted the ancient methods to work within Christian society while preserving their essential function. The barrier maintenance required regular renewal through ceremonial activities that the family had learned to disguise as natural deaths, disappearances, and accidents. Rosalind's extended sleep served as a focal point for these energies, while the secondary victims provided the life force necessary to maintain her condition indefinitely. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating, with new guardians trained to continue the work across generations. Hoffman's discovery of these documents provided context for the theological questions that had troubled him about the situation. Rather than simple evil or primitive superstition, the family's activities represented a complex belief system that attempted to reconcile pre-Christian and Christian worldviews. Their actions, while morally reprehensible by conventional standards, were undertaken with genuine conviction that they were protecting their community and the broader region from supernatural threats. Weber's practical examination of the barrier concept led him to search for physical evidence of whatever forces the family believed they were controlling. His exploration of the deepest chambers revealed construction that seemed to predate any known civilization in the region. Carved symbols and architectural features suggested influences from cultures that had no documented presence in Germanic territories. The deepest chamber contained a circular pit filled with stone formations that appeared to be natural, but were arranged with geometric precision that suggested intelligent design. The formations created acoustical effects that amplified and distorted sound in ways that made communication difficult and created an atmosphere of supernatural menace. Standing near the pit induced feelings of vertigo and disorientation that made extended observation nearly impossible. Around the pit's perimeter, Weber discovered evidence of regular ceremonial activity spanning many centuries. Burn marks indicated that fires had been lit, according to some schedule, while carved channels showed where liquids had been poured as offerings or components of ritual magic. Most disturbing were human remains that appeared to have been placed in specific locations around the pit, though their age and condition made identification impossible. The discovery of these deeper chambers and their contents forced both men to reconsider their understanding of what they had encountered. Rather than a simple case of murder disguised as supernatural activity, they faced evidence of practices that challenged their assumptions about history, religion, and the nature of reality itself. Whether the family's beliefs about supernatural barriers were accurate or delusional, their commitment to maintaining them had clearly been absolute for many generations. The decision about how to respond to their discoveries divided the two men along lines that reflected their different backgrounds and worldviews. Hoffman's theological training inclined him toward viewing the situation as a manifestation of evil that required exposure and elimination, regardless of the consequences. Weber's practical experience suggested that some situations were too complex and dangerous for simple solutions, especially when they involved entire communities that had adapted to unusual circumstances over many years. Their debate about appropriate action was influenced by the realization that their own survival might depend on the choice they made. The villagers had made their position clear. Knowledge of the situation was dangerous to community security. Dornwald had suggested that remaining in the chamber was an acceptable alternative to leaving, with information that could disrupt arrangements that had maintained regional stability for centuries. The moral complexity of their situation was deepened by evidence that the family's activities might indeed have prevented worse supernatural manifestations in the region. Historical records from surrounding areas showed patterns of mysterious deaths, disappearances, and supernatural phenomena that had not affected Steinbach and its immediate vicinity. Whether this protection resulted from the Dornwald family's activities or was simply coincidental was impossible to determine, but the correlation was striking. As they continued their exploration and debate, both men noticed gradual changes in their own mental state that suggested the chamber's environment was affecting their judgment and perception. Decision-making became increasingly difficult, while their sense of time and urgency diminished steadily. The realization that they might be succumbing to the same influences that had affected their predecessors added urgency to their need for action. Weber's examination of the chamber's exit routes revealed that their original entrance had been sealed during the night, presumably by the villagers who had participated in Richter's ceremony. Alternative passages existed, but led deeper underground rather than toward the surface. The hidden routes that connected to the manor above were accessible only through sections that required crawling through spaces barely large enough for human passage. The attempt to escape through these confined passages proved more difficult than anticipated. The routes were not designed for comfortable travel, but rather for emergency access and communication. Progress was slow and physically demanding, made worse by air quality that deteriorated as they moved away from the main chamber's ventilation systems. After several hours of effort, they emerged into a storage room beneath the manor's kitchen, exhausted, but closer to freedom. Their emergence into the manor proper revealed that the building was not as abandoned as it had initially appeared. Fresh supplies in the kitchen, recently used fireplaces and other signs of habitation suggested that someone had been maintaining the property as a functional residence. The realization that Dornwald had been living in the manor while maintaining his underground activities explained how he had been able to preserve Rosalind's condition for decades without attracting outside attention. Weber's discovery of recent correspondence in Dornwald's study provided evidence that the family's activities had not been entirely isolated from the broader world. Letters from contacts in other regions suggested a network of individuals and families engaged in similar practices, sharing information and resources to maintain what they described as the old agreements. The correspondence indicated that Steinbach was part of a larger system of supernatural barrier maintenance spanning much of Germanic Europe. The network's existence implied that their situation was not unique, but rather representative of activities occurring in remote communities throughout the region. The letters mentioned similar sleeping chambers, guardian families, and ceremonial requirements in locations from the Alps to the Baltic Sea. Most disturbing was the suggestion that these activities were coordinated according to astronomical and seasonal cycles that required precise timing and communication between sites. Hoffmann's examination of religious texts found in Dornwald's library revealed attempts to reconcile Christian theology with much older spiritual practices. Annotated Bibles showed interpretations that emphasized continuity between pre-Christian and Christian spiritual authority, while treatises on natural philosophy attempted to explain supernatural phenomena in terms compatible with emerging scientific understanding. The theological sophistication of these works suggested that the family's practices were not simply primitive superstitions, but rather represented a complex intellectual tradition that had adapted to changing cultural and religious circumstances over many centuries. The annotations showed familiarity with advanced theological concepts and contemporary philosophical debates, indicating that the guardians were educated individuals capable of sophisticated reasoning about their responsibilities. As evening approached, the two men faced the reality that their escape from the manor would need to be completed under cover of darkness to avoid detection by villagers who might be watching for their emergence. Weber's military experience suggested routes through the forest that would minimize their chances of encounter, while providing access to main roads leading away from the region. However, their plans for immediate departure were complicated by the discovery of recent letters indicating that other investigators were scheduled to visit Steinbach within the coming weeks. Academic researchers from Göttingen University had apparently been corresponding with local authorities about conducting folklore studies in the region, with specific interest in the Dornwald family's historical role in local traditions. The implications of allowing uninformed researchers to encounter the situation they were fleeing created a moral dilemma that neither man could ignore. Their own experience demonstrated the dangers facing anyone who investigated the manor without understanding the supernatural forces and community conspiracies involved. Simply escaping while leaving others to face similar or worse fates seemed morally unacceptable, but staying to warn or protect others would require confronting the villagers and possibly Dornwald himself. Weber's pragmatic assessment suggested that their responsibility was limited to their own survival and whatever information they could provide to outside authorities once they reached safety. Hoffmann's theological perspective demanded more active intervention to prevent harm to innocent researchers and to expose the evil being perpetuated in the name of community protection. Their debate was resolved by the appearance of Dornwald himself. who had apparently detected their escape from the underground chambers. His condition showed further deterioration since their last encounter. His apparent age had increased markedly, while his movements suggested both physical weakness and supernatural enhancement that defied natural explanation. Dornwald's approach was not hostile, but rather pleading, as he attempted to convince them that their departure would have catastrophic consequences for the region's supernatural stability. He described in detail the barriers that his family maintained and the forces that would be unleashed if their work was disrupted by outside interference. His account, while clearly influenced by generations of indoctrination into the family's beliefs, was delivered with conviction that suggested genuine fear about the consequences of abandoning his responsibilities. The old man's physical condition provided evidence for some of his claims about the supernatural nature of his situation. His apparent aging during the brief period since their initial encounter suggested that maintaining Rosalind's condition required continuous expenditure of life force that was rapidly depleting his remaining vitality. His estimate that he had perhaps days rather than weeks of life, remaining added urgency to his appeals for understanding and cooperation. Weber's observation of Dornwald's deterioration led him to suggest that the problem might resolve itself naturally if they simply waited for the old man's death to end the family's activities. However, Dornwald's response indicated that his death would not end Rosalind's supernatural sleep, but would simply leave her unattended and potentially dangerous. Without proper maintenance, her condition could become unstable in ways that would affect the entire region. The complexity of their situation deepened as they realized that simple solutions were not available. Exposing the truth might indeed protect future visitors, but could also result in supernatural chaos if Dornwald's warnings about regional barriers were accurate. Ignoring the situation might preserve regional stability, but would certainly result in continued deaths as young women continued to be drawn to their fate in the underground chambers. Hoffman's attempt to find a theological solution led him to propose conducting Christian rituals designed to break supernatural influences while providing spiritual protection for the region through legitimate religious practices. His suggestion involved consecrating the underground chambers, providing proper burial for the victims, and establishing regular Christian services to replace the pagan ceremonies that had maintained the barriers. Dornwald's response to this proposal was surprisingly positive, though he insisted that any transition from pagan to Christian practices would need to be conducted carefully to avoid disrupting the supernatural forces involved. His willingness to consider alternatives to the family's traditional methods suggested that his primary concern was maintaining protection rather than preserving specific practices for their own sake. The negotiation of terms for this transition revealed the depth of Dornwald's knowledge about supernatural forces and protective measures. His descriptions of the barrier's operation involved complex interactions between natural and supernatural energies that required precise management to maintain effectiveness. While his explanations often seemed to border on delusional fantasy, they also contained elements that suggested real understanding of forces beyond normal human comprehension. Weber's role in these discussions focused on practical aspects of implementation and security. His military background provided insights into maintaining secrecy while organizing complex operations, essential skills for any transition that would need to be conducted without attracting outside attention or disrupting community stability. The agreement they eventually reached involved a gradual transition from the family's pagan practices to Christian alternatives, with Hoffman providing theological expertise while Weber managed practical security concerns. Dornwald would cooperate by sharing his knowledge about barrier maintenance while accepting Christian consecration of the underground chambers and proper burial for previous victims. The implementation of their agreement began immediately, as Dornwald's deteriorating condition made delay impossible. Working through the night, they conducted Christian burial rites for the remains found in the deeper chambers, while Hoffmann performed consecration rituals designed to transform the space from pagan temple to Christian sanctuary. Rosalind's condition proved more resistant to Christian influence than they had hoped. Hoffmann's attempts to wake her through prayer and consecrated water had no apparent effect, while his efforts to break the supernatural sleep through religious authority seemed only to cause her distress without achieving awakening. Dornwald explained that her condition had become so deeply established that abrupt reversal might result in immediate death rather than natural awakening. The discovery that Richter might face the same fate, if not properly managed, added complexity to their efforts. Her transformation had been recent enough that reversal might be possible, but the process would require careful timing and preparation to avoid killing her through supernatural shock. Dornwald's expertise in managing these transitions became essential to any hope of saving her life. Working together throughout the following day, they developed a gradual awakening process that combined Dornwald's supernatural knowledge with Hoffmann's religious authority and Weber's practical skills. The process involved reducing the ceremonial influences, maintaining the supernatural sleep, while providing spiritual protection against whatever forces had originally created the condition. The first signs of success came when Richter began showing responses to external stimuli after receiving blessed water and having Christian prayers recited over her sleeping form. Her breathing patterns changed, becoming more natural, while her skin tone improved noticeably. However, her complete awakening required several days of careful attention and gradual adjustment to prevent supernatural backlash. Dornwald's death occurred on the third day of their efforts, apparently from the exhaustion of maintaining barrier protections while cooperating with the Christian transformation of his family's activities. His final words expressed satisfaction that the transition had begun successfully, and confidence that Hoffmann's religious authority would prove adequate to maintain regional protection through Christian rather than pagan methods. Richter's complete awakening occurred shortly after Dornwald's death, suggesting that his passing had removed some supernatural influence that had been maintaining her condition. Her memory of events in the underground chamber was fragmentary, but she retained enough awareness to confirm the general accuracy of what the two men had witnessed and experienced. The question of how to handle Rosalind's condition remained unresolved after Dornwald's death. Hoffmann's religious efforts had stabilized her situation without achieving awakening, while Weber's practical examination suggested that she might require more time and specialized care to recover completely. Her supernatural sleep appeared to be diminishing gradually, but complete reversal could take months or years of careful management. The arrival of the expected researchers from Göttingen University forced accelerated resolution of their situation. Academic investigators with scholarly rather than spiritual approaches to folklore study would be ill-equipped to handle supernatural phenomena or community conspiracies, making their protection a priority for the three survivors of the underground encounter. The solution they adopted involved partial disclosure to university authorities combined with careful management of research activities to prevent dangerous discoveries. Hoffmann's religious authority provided credibility for warnings about supernatural dangers, while Weber's practical knowledge enabled effective security measures around the manor and underground chambers. The researchers' investigation was successfully limited to safe areas of inquiry, with their findings contributing to academic understanding of Germanic folklore without exposing them to actual supernatural dangers. Their published papers later became important sources for scholars studying the evolution of pre-Christian practices in post-medieval European communities. Rosalind's gradual awakening continued over the following months, though her complete recovery required more than a year of careful attention and spiritual support. Her memories of the extended sleep period remained unclear, but her personality and intelligence appeared unaffected by the supernatural preservation process. Her integration into normal life was complicated by the need to explain her apparent age and lack of contemporary knowledge. But these challenges were eventually resolved through careful planning and community cooperation. The long-term stability of supernatural barriers in the region remained a concern for Hoffman, who established regular Christian services designed to provide spiritual protection while monitoring for signs of supernatural disturbance. His approach proved successful in maintaining regional calm without requiring the human sacrifices that had sustained the Dornwald family's activities for centuries. Weber's military experience proved valuable in training selected villagers to recognize and respond to potential supernatural threats, creating a community defense system that relied on practical skills and Christian faith rather than pagan ritual and human sacrifice. The transition to this new system was gradual but successful, with no apparent increase in supernatural disturbances or regional instability. The final resolution of their adventure came several years later, when Hoffman received official recognition from church authorities for his success in converting a pagan stronghold to Christian practice without disrupting regional peace. His detailed reports of the conversion process became important documents in church archives, though the most sensitive details about supernatural phenomena were omitted from official records. Weber eventually married Richter and settled in Steinbach, where his practical skills and her medical knowledge made them valuable members of the community. Their decision to remain in the village reflected both personal attachment to the place where they had met and recognition that their unique knowledge about local supernatural history made them valuable guardians of community safety. Rosalind's fate proved more complex, as her extended supernatural preservation had left her with abilities and knowledge that set her apart from normal human experience. She eventually left Steinbach to pursue studies that would help her understand her unique condition, though she maintained correspondence with the village and returned periodically to assist with supernatural monitoring and protection activities. The manor itself was eventually converted to serve as a Christian retreat center, with the underground chambers transformed into meditation spaces and prayer chapels. The conversion was successful in removing supernatural threats while preserving the historical significance of the site, though access to the deepest chambers remained restricted to trained individuals capable of managing any residual supernatural influences. The academic researchers who had originally planned to study the Dornwald family's folklore eventually published papers that contributed significantly to scholarly understanding of Germanic cultural evolution, though their work was based on carefully edited information that omitted the most dangerous aspects of what they had encountered. Their research became influential in academic circles without exposing other scholars to supernatural dangers. Years later, when Wilhelm Grimm received Hoffmann's detailed account of these events, he made the decision to exclude any version of the Sleeping Beauty story from their published collections. The parallels between the traditional fairy tale and the supernatural horrors they had encountered in Steinbach convinced him that some stories were too dangerous to preserve in popular literature, even in modified form. The documents describing these events were sealed in church archives with instructions that they remain classified for at least 2 centuries, ensuring that future researchers would have access to accurate information about supernatural phenomena while protecting contemporary populations from knowledge that could lead them into similar dangers. The village of Steinbach gradually returned to normal life patterns, though residents maintained heightened awareness of supernatural possibilities and continued practicing protective measures that combined traditional caution with Christian faith. The community's experience with supernatural threats and successful resolution created a model for handling similar situations that occasionally arose in other remote regions. The ultimate lesson learned from the Dornwald family's activities was that supernatural threats required spiritual solutions rather than simply practical or academic approaches. The combination of faith, knowledge, and community cooperation proved essential to managing forces beyond normal human understanding while protecting innocent people from harm. Contemporary church authorities eventually recognized the importance of training selected clergy to handle supernatural phenomena, leading to the establishment of specialized programs for priests serving in regions where pre-Christian practices might still influence local conditions. These programs drew heavily on Hoffman's experience and documentation from the Steinbach case. The broader implications of what had been discovered at the Dornwald Manor influenced theological discussions about the relationship between Christian and pre-Christian spiritual practices, contributing to more nuanced understanding of cultural conversion processes and the persistence of ancient beliefs within Christian communities. Scientific investigators who later gained access to restricted church archives found evidence supporting theories about psychological and social factors that could create apparently supernatural phenomena, though they were unable to provide complete explanations for all aspects of what had been documented in the Steinbach case. The story of Rosalind Dornwald and her supernatural sleep became a cautionary tale used in theological education to illustrate the dangers of syncretistic practices that attempted to combine Christian and pagan elements without proper understanding of the spiritual forces involved. Her eventual recovery and reintegration into normal life demonstrated that supernatural influences could be overcome through appropriate intervention. The legacy of these events continued to influence regional folklore and religious practices for generations, though the most dangerous details were carefully excluded from popular traditions to prevent imitation or inadvertent recreation of the circumstances that had created the original supernatural situation. Modern researchers studying historical documents from this period often note the unusual nature of the Steinbach case and its implications for understanding the persistence of pre-Christian practices in post-medieval European communities, though access to complete documentation remains restricted to qualified scholars with appropriate spiritual and academic preparation. The true version of the Sleeping Beauty story, as documented in these sealed church archives, remains one of the most disturbing examples of how beloved fairy tales can originate from supernatural horrors that challenge the understanding and faith of those who first encountered them in their original unmodified form.